Alright everybody, welcome back to the online video lecture series for Philosophy 102 Ethics. This is going to be our final video, and it's also going to be the culmination of our discussion of the ethical theory of Immanuel Kant. You'll remember that in our previous video we discussed what is known as the principle of humanity. It's this abstract principle from Kant which says that there's a moral duty to never treat another person as a mere means to an end. Instead, they must always be treated as an end in themselves. And put more sort of succinctly or less abstractly, it's just a principle which says you're never allowed to use someone as a means to an end. You can't use them as an object to get what you want, to serve your purposes. Every person and every rational being needs to be shown the sort of respect and status that recognizes that they are a being with their own inherent value, their own intrinsic worth. And so, we talked last time about a number of ways in which this isn't really just an abstract principle, but it's a principle which has important ramifications for how we ought to act morally and ethically. And in this lesson I want to look at another of those implications, and specifically I want to see how Kant applies the principle of humanity to the ethics of punishment. As we're going to see, for Kant, the principle of humanity really undergirds not only his view of why we punish wrongdoers and criminals, but it undergirds his view of what sorts of punishments are acceptable. And we're going to see that for him, in a rather maybe paradoxical manner, or at least an unexpected manner, he thinks that if you take the principle of humanity seriously, if you think you have a duty to show respect to all persons, to never treat them as a means to an end, if you take that seriously, then it implies that all murderers should be given the death penalty. And in fact, anything less than the death penalty is simply disrespectful. So, in order to see why Kant thinks this, which might be sort of, at first seem a sort of bizarre, unexpected conclusion, I want to set up the issue by considering the following question. In general, what is it that justifies criminal punishment? When you think about punishment, you think, well, okay, punishment always involves some entity. In this case, we're really talking about the state, but of course there's other sorts of punishments. Parents punish their children, etc., right? In the workplace, a boss might levy some sort of punishment against an employee who does something wrong. But right, we're really talking about punishments by the state against citizens. And in any of those contexts, we can ask the question, what is it that gives us the right to punish someone who's done something wrong? Right? What is it that justifies criminal punishment? And there are multiple theories, but for us, we're going to focus on two major approaches to this question. So the first is a consequentialist approach, and we'll call this the consequentialist theory of punishment. And this theory says, well, an act of punishment is justified if it produces a better overall outcome for society. So a utilitarian like Mill would take this view and say, well, why do we levy parking fines or put people in jail? Or if it is in fact justifiable, why would we put someone to death through capital punishment? If any of those things are justified, it has to be because they produce a better overall outcome for society. If you compare a society where we don't do those things and where we do those things, the society where we levy the punishments would have to be the better society, the happier society, the one with better outcomes. Okay, so this is the consequentialist view, and if you understand consequentialism, if you understand utilitarianism, shouldn't be a surprise that this is one approach to punishment. Now also, if you understand Kant's moral theory to this point, it also shouldn't be a surprise to you that Kant completely rejected the consequentialist theory of punishment. As we'll see, he thought this was a very disrespectful way of actually looking at wrongdoers or criminals. Instead, Kant advocated for what's known as the retributivist theory of punishment. And what does this theory say? It says, well, an act of punishment is justified if and only if the criminal deserves to suffer the ill effects of the punishment based on her behavior. The idea behind the retributive view of punishment is, look, the reason we're punishing you isn't to create better outcomes for society. Maybe the punishment will create better outcomes for society, and if it does, that's great. But the reason we're punishing you is because you've done something wrong and you deserve to have something bad done to you. And as we're going to see, and as Kant defends in his article The Right of Punishing, which we're examining now, Kant takes the retributivist view of punishment. He rejects the consequentialist one. He thinks it's completely antithetical to the very nature of punishment. Okay, so we have these two different theories. To begin, I want to explore the consequentialist theory a little further before we come back to Kant's own theory, the retributivist theory. So one thing to think about is, okay, let's say we take the consequentialist view. The reason punishing is justified is because it produces better outcomes for society. What would those outcomes be? What would the good consequences be? And there are a number of things you could point to, but in general, some of the main ones would be the following. So one, a consequentialist would say, well, the reason we punish people is because of deterrence. Right? If we have some bad behavior, like parking in the wrong spot, and we attach a fine to it, then it's going to deter, it's going to provide a disincentive, it's going to make people less likely to do that bad behavior in the future. So if people know that they're going to have a fine levied against them, they'll say, well, maybe it's not really worth it to park there, I'll park where I'm supposed to. And the same for any other crime, right? So it deters future crime. Obviously, that's a good thing for society. Now, if you think more specifically about imprisonment, then another beneficial outcome that would be attributed to punishment would be, well, security. We're taking an individual who might be dangerous, who might be ill-motivated and willing to do bad things. We're taking this individual away from normal society, and by imprisoning them, they can't harm or hurt anyone else. And then finally, depending on the case and depending on the situation in which the person is being punished, many consequentialists will point to rehabilitation. They'll say punishment doesn't just need to be retribution for something you've done wrong. If we can, temporarily take someone out of society, try to examine what has caused this bad behavior, do what we can to fix the bad behavior so it doesn't happen again, and then return the person to society, then society wins by now having a happy, productive citizen, and that person's life is better as well. So if you're a consequentialist, then when you answer the question, why is punishment justified, you're usually giving one of these answers. These are the beneficial outcomes. Now, I want to focus for a minute, and I want to think about, is the consequentialist theory the right way to view punishment? Kant didn't think so. So what's lying behind this idea? Because it sounds right. Like, yeah, these are in fact benefits of punishment, ideally, so maybe that's what justifies punishment. So let's think about deterrence for a moment. One thing to consider is, are there any punishments that would be effective at deterring crime, but you don't think would be justified, and you probably don't think anyone would think they would be justified? Well, I can think of a few examples. One, for instance, we might say, well, what if we just punish someone who is innocent? What if we notice that the crime rates were going up, and we say, look, if we just start making a real public display of the way of a real public display of our punishments, right? So let's say, you know what, crime rate's going up. We'll round up some innocent people. We will violently punish them in the town square. It'll be televised. People can come watch if they want. And this would obviously be a horrible spectacle and display. But you can imagine that it might have, it's an empirical question, but you can imagine it could possibly have positive outcome on deterrence. People, when faced with that punishment face to face, they might say, well, I'm going to rethink whether I really want to commit crime or not. But notice all the ways, even if it were the case that was a good way to deter crime, notice all the ways in which that strikes us as just sort of a wrong-headed way to go about punishment. First of all, we're imagining we just rounded up some innocent people to make examples out of them. That doesn't seem right. In addition, we might be opposed to the violent nature of the punishment. We might say, well, sure, people need to suffer punishments, but aren't there some limits, Are there some limits in terms of cruel and unusual punishments, for instance? So, this is going to be an issue for the consequentialist view. You can always come up with some examples in which it seems like, yeah, we could do that and it would deter crime, but it doesn't really seem just. It doesn't seem right. And it's that sort of intuition that lies behind Kant's view that maybe, although these are good things about punishment, we do want these good consequences for society, maybe in fact that's not actually what punishment is all about. Maybe it's about something else. Okay, so to get at what the difference might be, there's another way to sort of look at the issue, or the difference between these two theories. So if you think about the consequentialist theory of punishment, you'll notice it's a forward-looking theory. And what does that mean? Well, whenever we're thinking about should we punish this person or not, we're always looking into the future. Will doing so bring about good consequences or bad ones? But the retributivist view of theory of punishment, on the other hand, is backward-looking. Because what we really care about, yes, it'd be good if there were good future consequences that come from the punishment, but we're really looking at what is this person's past behavior? And does this past behavior justify us in treating them poorly and levying a punishment against them? Think about the example I just gave, in which you are punishing an innocent person to make an example of them to lower crime rates. If you take a backward-looking approach, this person hasn't done anything wrong. So even though the consequences overall might be good for society of punishing them, there seems to be something fundamentally unjust about punishing an innocent person whose past behavior does not seem to warrant what we're doing to them. And it's this idea that people should get what they deserve, and what they deserve is determined by the things they have done in the past. That is the idea that underlies Kant's theory, and in part explains why he rejects the consequentialist theory of punishment. And you should be able to see the principle of humanity at play here. Because think about that innocent person we're thinking about punishing for the good of society. Isn't that person a perfect example of someone who we're using as a mere means to an end? We're saying, yes, we know you're innocent, you haven't done anything wrong, but for the good and security of society, we have to do something bad to you. We have to punish you. Well, okay, but doesn't this person have their own rights? Isn't this person a rational being? Don't they have their own inherent importance? Isn't it wrong to use them in that way? This is fundamentally what underlies Kant's view. And you can see this in a number of passages from The Right of Punishing. He says, "The penal law is a categorical imperative, and woe to him who creeps through the serpent windings of utilitarianism to discover some advantage that may discharge him from the justice of punishment." What are these serpent windings of utilitarianism? Well, it's just the sort of reasoning we went through here. Well, what if we punish this person in this way? Would that possibly bring about greater happiness to the whole? Or what if we just didn't punish this person? Maybe if we punish that person, people are going to get angry, so we shouldn't punish them, because that would bring about better consequences. That's what Kant means by the serpent windings of utilitarianism. Instead of just focusing on, does this person deserve to be punished based on what they did, we're trying to determine in the future and sort of reason our way to what will be the greatest overall benefit. So first of all, we see that Kant is anti-consequentialist. And the same sort of reasoning, his same support for retributivism, he also makes clear in The Right of Punishing, underlies his support for the death penalty. So in a famous passage, he paints the following scenario. He says, even if a civil society resolved to dissolve itself with the consent of all its members, as might be supposed in the case of a people inhabiting an island, resolving to separate and scatter themselves throughout the whole world. So what's going on here? He's imagining, well, let's say there's this island in the middle of the ocean, people were living there, but then they say, you know what, we're done with the society, we're going to rip up the Constitution, we're all going to go our separate ways. Okay, so they're just going to undermine this society and go live their lives. So what should they do before they leave? Well, here's one of the things Kant says must be done. He says the last murderer lying in the prison ought to be executed before the resolution was carried out. This ought to be done in order that everyone may realize the desert of his deeds, and that blood guiltlessness may not remain upon the people. So he says, yeah, before you pack up and all go your separate ways and rip up the Constitution and get out of here, make sure that the last murderer in prison who is awaiting execution, make sure that person is killed. Now that's a pretty strong statement to make. Because from a consequentialist view, it wouldn't make any sense, right? I mean, there's no, in no way is levying that final punishment going to protect society. We're already dissolving society. There's no society to protect. And yet Kant says it is still a categorical imperative that this person must be punished for their crimes, and because, as we'll see, he thinks the death penalty is the only punishment that matches the crime of murder, the last person in prison must be executed. So Kant takes his retributivism very seriously. All the guilty and only the guilty must be punished, and they must be punished in a way that's proportionate to their crime. So I want to take a look at, because I've told you at this point that Kant's a retributivist and that he supports the death penalty, but we should take a moment to look a little closer at how Kant actually gets there. What is his reasoning? So I'm going to call this Kant's retributivist argument for the death penalty. So P1. Some criminal punishment is justified if and only if the punishment serves as retribution for the behavior. So this is what we were just saying, right? Kant categorically rejects the consequentialist view. As he says in this passage, juridical punishment can never be administered merely as a means for promoting another good, but must in all cases be imposed only because the individual on whom it is inflicted has committed a crime. So let's imagine, in the previous case I was saying, imagine someone who's innocent and we're punishing them anyway. Well, imagine now someone who's guilty. Imagine someone who actually has committed the crime. And, okay, let's say it's a serious crime, they're going to get serious jail time. And they ask us, why is it that I have to go to jail for this crime? And our answer is, because if we send you to jail for this crime, it'll deter future crime, it'll make society safer. You can imagine that individual saying, well, wait a minute, why are you allowed to put me in jail to make society safer? Why are you allowed to use me as a means to an end in that fashion? And it's exactly what Kant objects to. So here he says, no, the reason we punish someone is never because it's to promote the good of society or any other good. It simply is because you deserve to be punished. And he says against such treatment, his inborn personality has a right to protect him. Kant's point is that if we really were in the business of punishing people to promote another good, you would have a right of self-defense against that punishment. It wouldn't be justified. So his purpose then isn't to say, well, we shouldn't punish. His purpose is to say we should only punish individual criminals because their past behavior warrants it, because they deserve to have something bad happen to them. Okay, so P1 just says retribution is the only real justification for punishment. So the next question is, well, what does retribution demand? So let's look at P2 of the argument. Some punishment can serve as retribution for the criminal's behavior, if and only if that punishment treats the criminal in a way that's sufficiently serious to match the severity of the criminal's wrongdoing. So here Kant expresses what I'm going to call the principle of retributive equality. Okay, so we say retribution is the only justified theory of punishment. What does that demand? It demands that whatever the punishment is that you're getting is equal in severity to what you did. And we see Kant explain that here. Hence it may be said, if you slander another, you slander yourself. If you steal from another, you steal from yourself. If you strike another, you strike yourself. If you kill another, you kill yourself. So what Kant is pointing to here is that your actions are not simply personal actions. If you harm another person, then what you are essentially saying is that you deserve to be harmed in that exact same way. And he continues on, if you steal from another, you steal from yourself. Okay, so retribution requires this sort of equality of punishment. Now, we should probably stop and think about, well, why is Kant saying this? And if you understand a lot of the foundation of his moral theory that we've looked at so far, it makes complete sense. So recall to yourself the principle of the categorical imperative. The principle of the categorical imperative, right, essentially says, only act on those maxims that you would will to be universal laws of nature. And we said, what does that mean? Only act on those personal rules for action that you think it would be okay for everybody to follow. And what underlies this is the idea that whenever you act in a certain way, you're implicitly saying that this is how you accept other people to act as well. Because look, for you not to accept that would mean to think you're special. Oh, I can act in this way, but other people can't. Okay, so now apply this to criminal wrongdoing. Suppose that we have someone who murders another person. Okay. Well, what are they implicitly saying? If they're a rational being and they think that, there's a sense in which they're equal to other rational beings, they're saying, well, I'm sort of endorsing a world in which I think all people should be able to act this way. Anyone should be able to murder another person. And in Kant's way of looking at things, this means it's sort of that, well, you've made your bed in it, now you can sleep in it. If you really do think that it's acceptable to murder other people, if you think a universe in which that maxim could be a universal law that all people should follow, then you should have no problem with us treating you that way as well. And that's exactly why Kant says, the undeserved evil which one commits on another is to be regarded as perpetrated on himself. If you steal from another person, you're saying you're okay with other people stealing from you. If you slander another person, you're okay with other people slandering you. And this is why fundamentally, in order to treat people in the way they deserve, which is what the retributivist theory of punishment says, whatever punishment we give you has to be of equal severity to what you did. Now, it's also important to see how this is related to the principle of humanity. Because remember, the principle of humanity is all about showing respect for persons. And you might say, well, Ryan, why is it so important? Why does it matter that we punish people in a way that's equal to the severity of what they did? Well, one way to think about this, think about for a moment those beings, those individuals that we don't treat in that way. Right, so who are the individuals who we say, yes, I know you did this bad thing, but I'm not going to treat you necessarily with that same severity? I think the clearest example here is of a child. Right, when a child does something bad, especially if they're very young, our first thought isn't, okay, what can I do to this child that will be the exact severity of what they just did? In some cases, that would be actually a very cruel way of treating a child. No, actually, usually our first thought is, maybe not our only thought, but one of the thoughts would be, okay, what is the age of this child? What is a punishment that's appropriate for their age? How much can they handle? Right, so a very young child, for instance, just merely a minute of time out could be a very harsh punishment for them. It would be difficult for them to handle really anything more. In some cases, even mentioning time out can really be quite a trying experience for a child. So when we're dealing with children, we don't apply this same sort of idea of retributive equality. We don't say that, well, whatever you do, we have to do back to you. And why is that? Well, we don't think that children are fully rational beings. Unlike an adult who we say, well, if you're acting this way, then you're sort of implicitly endorsing the idea that everybody else should too. When a child acts incorrectly, to a certain extent, we don't think they're fully aware of what they're doing, or they're just not fully rational in the way that an adult is. So one way to think about this is, with children, we take a certain amount of mercy, right? We don't punish them with the same force of the wrongdoing that they did. And that's totally fine. Kant would have no problem with that. But now go back to our example of the murder. We say, look, I know you killed this other individual, you took their life, but we're not going to take your life. We're not going to treat you with the same severity. And why is that? Well, we're going to take mercy on you. Well, wait a minute. Wouldn't that just mean you're treating this person, this adult, this rational human being, as if they were a child? And what could be more disrespectful than treating an adult as if they were a child? So this is why fundamentally Kant thinks P2 of this argument, that we should punish someone with the same severity of what they did, is implied by the principle of humanity. It follows from the idea that we must respect persons. To treat someone with anything less than the severity of what they did is a sign of disrespect. We're not treating you as a rational adult human being, we're treating you like a child. And it's disrespectful to treat adults like children. Alright, so we've seen that for Kant, retribution justifies punishment, then retribution implies that we have to have equal severity in punishment. And then P3, what about specifically about the death penalty? Kant's claim is that the death penalty is the only punishment that's sufficiently serious to match the severity of the crime of murder. Now, this premise is one, and we can see him expressing this in a number of ways. Whoever has committed murder must die. He says there is no likeness or proportion between life, however painful, and death. So one thing that's underlying this is that Kant says, well, death is the ultimate bad thing one can suffer. And there's nothing you can do to someone in their life that can compare to it. So for the ultimate crime, you need the ultimate punishment. And this is again why, in the passage I read earlier, he says the last murderer lying in prison must be executed. It's the only punishment available to match the crime of murder. Now what's interesting about this argument is that you could be a retributivist, you could think P1 is true, you could think that retribution requires some equality in the severity of punishment. You could agree with P2, but not necessarily be on board with Kant in terms of P3. You might think that there are other punishments that are just as bad as death. And there'd be a couple ways that you could go, or in some sense, there are ways you could think that death doesn't really match the crime of murder. One thing to think about is when we talked about the apology. Socrates made some arguments that death itself isn't really a bad thing, or if it's not, even if it's bad, it's not as bad as we typically make it out to be. If Socrates is right about that, then perhaps the problem is that death isn't serious enough. Another way you could go is you could say, well, this doesn't imply that murderers need the death penalty. Maybe something like life in prison would be sufficient. Maybe you might even argue that life in prison would be worse than death. And there could be justification for that. You'd have to think about all the time you'd have to spend thinking about your previous life, thinking about your mistakes with the regret, maybe resentment toward the state, resentment toward other people for what's happened to you. Of course, if that is the case, then one thing to keep in mind would be, if you say life in prison is more severe than the death penalty, then Kant also couldn't get on board there, because he says the punishment has to match the crime. If the punishment is more severe than the crime, well, then that's not good either. There's of course more to say here, and I'd be very interested actually to hear your thoughts on P3 and whether you think the death penalty is the only punishment sufficiently serious to match the crime of murder. But in any case, we'll leave that for the discussion. As always, thank you for watching, and that'll be the end of this video series.